Before we dive in, tell me where you're reading this from in the world, and don't forget to click subscribe. Now lean in. This is a story of a young woman, a raw frontier, and a decision that will change everything. The wagon stopped with a tired sigh at the edge of a new town. Red dust rose and fell like a curtain. The heat laid a hand on every surface and would not let go. Reverend Jonah Alder stepped out first, boots already flecked with the dust of the trail, then turned to help his daughter. Miriam Alder, 18 and newly unmoored from New England's ordered lanes, took his hand and swung down with more steadiness than she felt. She had always been a creature of careful patterns, folded linens, measured prayers, the polite encounters of parlors and church aisles. The frontier was a different language, raw, loud, fragrant with horse sweat and gumbo of strangers' lives. Miriam smoothed the hem of her plain dress and pressed her palm to the small silver cross at her throat, a reflex she'd had since childhood. Her chest felt too full for the simple phrase of prayer. They walked toward the half-built church where Jonah had already begun to plan a congregation. Around them, the town's single thoroughfare wound past a saloon with sun-faded paint, a general store, a blacksmith's forge. Workmen paused and glanced. Women exchanged tight smiles. It all landed on Miriam like a current. She felt watched, curious eyes, rough curiosity, and a part of her that had practiced modesty and reserve responded in confusion to the attention. That's when she saw them. Two men stood together in the shadow of the livery, taller than anyone she had ever seen. They moved like old trees in the wind, separate trunks, but their motions matched, a twin rhythm. Their hats shaded strong faces, their shirts were dust-streaked and fit like armor. The men's jawlines were weathered, their shoulders broad as doors. They were brothers. Jonah's new neighbors had whispered on the wagon, twin Hargroves, Silas and Thaddeus, who ran the largest spread for day's ride. One of them tipped his hat. It should have been a polite rural gesture. For Miriam, it landed differently. The look behind the gesture was direct and assessing. Not quite a smile, but not entirely hostile either. Jonah was already speaking about beams and pews and the mercy of finding such a place. Miriam wanted to step into the church and be the dutiful daughter, but the echo of those two faces clung to her as she crossed the threshold. She pressed her fingers against the cross at her throat until the silver bit cold into her skin. Inside, the church smelled of fresh-cut wood and cedar. Light slanted through the single window in a slow, golden blade. Jonah paced, traded greetings, outlined schedules for Sunday services and catechism. Miriam smiled at the right times, answered the right way, but the world had narrowed. Two silhouettes beneath a brim had set her heart to racing in a way sermons never had. That first night she slept in the small room behind the pulpit. Thin boards let moonlight strip across the floor. Far-off laughter and a piano, somebody learning chords, drifted in like a reminder that life carried on outside of her private interior. She lay awake longer than she wanted, thoughts skittering to that glance in the street and to a question she had never asked herself aloud. What if she could be wanted, not as a church badge, not as something respectable, but as a person whose body answered and remembered desire? Footsteps paused outside her window. Voices, low, measured, confident. She's new. She'll be perfect, one murmured. She doesn't know it yet, said the other, words threaded with certainty. Miriam held her breath until the sound moved on. The next day the men vanished. The gap where they had been felt bigger than their absence. Her hands trembled as she worked, sweeping plank floors, polishing what would later be pews. When Reverend Jonah left to meet the town mayor and to begin organizing a schoolhouse, Miriam welcomed the quiet task of empty rooms in which she could steady her breathing. The afternoon sun had warmed the church when a shadow fell across the open doorway. She looked up as if obeying a summons and froze. Silas and Thaddeus filled the entrance like two pillars. They ducked to get in beneath the lintel, smiles curving at the edges of their mouths. The door closed with a decisive click. Silas moved closer first. Up close, his hair was the color of river reeds and his face carried the kind of rough beauty that made ordinary phrases like handsome inadequate. He smelled like leather and ash and the wide world. Thaddeus stepped behind Miriam, his presence reserved and steady, a grounding weight at her back. They introduced themselves with voices that lowered around her name as if it were a secret being shared. They spoke of ranch work and horses, and the need for someone with a steady hand to help bring the town into the groove of evening prayers. They told quiet domestic lies about how the Hargroves liked to welcome newcomers properly. They offered invitations, an afternoon gathering to meet the county folk, a ride to the ranch come Saturday. Jonah thanked them as a man eager for acceptance, for alliances to make his church flourish. Miriam's throat worked. The men's words were polite, but their gestures were not merely neighborly. Silas's hand found the small of her back once as he steadied her to her feet. Thaddeus's thumb rubbed the callus on her shoulder, as if testing the skin. Under the veneer of welcome lay a recognition, a claim. They spoke as if they had already decided a place for her in their lives. That night, sleep felt like a treason against her theology. She kneaded the inside of her wrist until the bruise of her own anxious pulse faded. Her mind's interior movie played scenes of two strong hands, of a body learned and known, but the film stopped short of image and stayed in sensation. The imagined weight of a palm, the idea of being steadied and also wanted. It was shameful and fierce all at once. Saturday came with a heat that made the horizon go wavy. The Hargrove ranch appeared as a mirage of wooden corrals, horses flicking tails like banners. It was larger than she had imagined, a house that had acquired itself step by step, pieced together by winters and harvests. Standing on the porch, the brothers looked carved out of the place itself, as if the land had raised them and filled them with a kind of rugged authority. When Silas took Miriam's hand to help her down, the contact felt like a vow. At the house, the rhythm of ranch life pulsed around her. Men paused work to stare or to nod, but mostly went about tasks that meant something in the concrete way that pews and sermons had not yet. The housekeeper, Magda, with fingers that sewed and eyes that had seen much, moved like a kindly weather vane. She led Miriam to a room that was simple and honest. It smelled of lavender and iron and the smoke of the hearth. Miriam sat on the bed and let the world recede into a single focus, the presence of the Hargroves. Silas came into the room like the tide, slow and inevitable. He asked one question. "Are you afraid of us, Miriam?" She almost lied, but the truth sounded better. "Yes," she whispered. He nodded as if that was reasonable. "Good," he said. "Fear keeps you alive, but there's a different kind of fear, the one that comes when something makes you feel whole and also uncertain. We'll give you time, we'll be patient, but we won't be blind to what we want. There is a tenderness that can sit behind possession, a careful hand on a cheek, a promise made in low tones." Thaddeus's presence at her back felt like a hand on the small of her spine, protection, perhaps, or a gentle pressure of fate. When Silas kissed her for the first time, it was like a bell swung too near. It loosened things inside her she had taught herself to hold rigid. The kiss was not a conquest so much as a translation, sudden, affirmative, intimate. It made every thought she had rehearsed for years feel small. They did not force her. They coaxed and invited. The difference mattered. Over the days that followed, Silas's ardor was the raw press of a weathered hand. Thaddeus's approach, the long, soft patience of a river. They took mirrored approaches, one faster, one slower. Each lesson they gave was in consent and in listening. When she flinched, the motion ceased. They were unhurried in a way that was almost kinder than waiting for anything at all. By the time twilight softened the ranch, Miriam had made choices that would have shocked her parents. She spoke quietly that evening, her voice foreign in her own ears, of staying. Not a hostage's surrender, but an admission of want. She surprised herself by saying, "I'll come back to the town when you wish. But I don't want to leave tonight." They looked at her as if she had handed them a treasure, equal parts relief and assertion. In the way the Hargroves spoke of the future, marriage was not an absurdity, but an adjustment. "We'll make it right," Silas promised one night, when the home had settled into a hush, and their three shadows lay tangled on the blankets. One of us in the records, both of us in the life. Miriam's conscience was a compass that had been trained to point a certain way. She had been taught sin and humility, the demands of duty, the humility of single-minded piety. But here in the Hargrove bedroom, the map redrew itself. She tasted the possibility of life arranged not by strict codes, but by a private covenant, tender and fierce. She loved her father and the moral scaffolding he offered. She also felt, newly and fully, that a life could be built on hands and warmth and opinionated kindness as much as on prayer. When she consented to bind herself to them, if binding could be a thing shared by three, she did so with awareness, aware of what it would mean for her father, aware of the scandal it would cause in certain parlors back east, aware of the particular brand of comfort and control that came wrapped up in the Hargrove's presence. Her choice had weight, and she placed it deliberately. They married in the half-finished church beneath Jonah's careful sermon. The town came out in rough finery. The Hargroves sat in the front pew, as if the world already acknowledged their place. Silas stood at the altar with a steady hand, Thaddeus at his side, a steadying force who would be there when storms came. Jonah read vows that were both scripture and negotiation. The ring on Miriam's finger was small and bright. The life that slid into place beside it was large and enduring. The nights that followed were a soft insistence. They showed her a tenderness unbound by single ownership, how to read another's breathing for comfort at 2 a.m, how to let one body cool against you while the other warms. They taught, by demonstration and by conversation, that intimacy could be shared without subtraction, that attention could be multiplied without lessening. It was not always easy. Jealousy flickered like a wind-lit candle once or twice, then was tended and smoothed. They made promises we all learned to make in one form or another, to protect, to instruct, to love. Miriam learned to ride with a hand on a rein and an elbow over a saddle horn, hair whipped back behind a cap that had once seemed wildly inappropriate. She learned to break a horse's trust and then to be trusted by the beast. She learned the cadence of ranch life, early rises, the steady comfort of labors that left her palms raw and whole. In the wash of daily tasks, she found a new prayer, not a recitation of precepts, but an honest gratitude for bread, for the hum of a pot on the fire, for the deep-set peace of being known. The town had opinions. It had mouths and tall tales. Reverend Jonah, shrewd and practical beneath his piety, made a virtue of alliance. Miriam's father saw lucky hands in her marriage to men who could keep a church safe and a family fed. There were whispers, some sharp, some envious, but many kept their heads down. Power has a way of quieting judgment. The Hargroves were respected men. In a place where the land took claim of your life, alliances were often wiser than condemnation. Miriam became, in time, the fulcrum between two worlds. She remained Jonah's daughter, and also the ranchwoman who tied sacks of seed and drew milk. Her two husbands taught her the language of pleasure alongside the language of faith. Their love, messy and imperfect and rich, surprised the town into tolerance, if not full acceptance, then at least a careful ignoring. They wanted children, and the world that had once seemed so clean and certain became messy and miraculous again. When Miriam's belly first rounded, there was no guessing which of them had fathered the child. It did not matter much to those who loved her. Babies do not care for paternity like parlor conversation. They care for warmth and milk and names. The first child was a boy who took his father's stride and his mother's will. 2 more followed in years that threaded together like a braid. A son with his mother's stubborn chin, and a daughter who carried a laugh that sounded like both brothers at once. Years tempered them all. Reverend Jonah watched his congregation swell around the church he had built, then annexed, then beautified. He watched his daughter turn from a quiet New England girl into a woman who kept accounts, who bandaged stockinged calves and her worst fears. The Hargroves became pillars of the community, not saints, not scoundrels, but strong men whose opinions mattered and whose kindness was practical. The town learned to lean on their steadiness. Miriam grew into her role with a surprising grace. She could read a ledger and soothe a crying child with equal ease. She could love 2 men as a person loves water and sky, different in quality, yet essential both. Her hardest transformation was internal, letting go of the idea that virtue lived only in sacrifice. She learned that morality could be braided with desire, and that both could be honest. When visitors from the East arrived, their faces split into surprised curiosity and veiled condemnation when they saw the Hargrove household. A woman with flour on her apron, 2 men who were affectionate in public, children who ran under tables without needing permission. Miriam found herself telling her story like a parable. The road west brings unexpected things, she would say, half teasing, half wise. She spoke more often about the courage it took to choose a life than about the mechanics of it. People were hungry, she discovered, for narratives where people followed their hearts without cruelty. Late one spring afternoon, when the light had that long golden ache to it and the children's laughter was a map of meaning in the yard, Miriam sat on the porch between Silas and Thaddeus. They were older in a way that made them softer around the eyes, but no less formidable in their love. She thought of the day they first arrived, of the choice she had made, so shamefully private then, so public now. "You ever regret it?" she asked, watching a boy fall from a pony and be righted by two big hands. Silas looked at her. He kissed the back of her hand, the same way he had the night in the small bedroom, when promises were new and raw. "Never," he said. "Not for a day." Thaddeus added quietly, "We chose each other every dawn. That's the work, like feed and fence. Not easy, but it keeps us honest." Miriam smiled. The world was not a sermon. It was bread and horses and lullabies, and scandal whispered like a passing storm. She had kept her faith, even if the shape of it had altered. Her prayers sounded different now. They were less about rules and more about gratitude. There were hard moments, as there are in all human contracts: sudden sickness, neighborly disputes, the sticky business of jealousy and pride. But there was also a softness underneath every hard lesson, a recognition that love asks things of us we did not always expect. It changes our edges, it makes us braver and more forgiving. Years later, when her own daughter asked questions about choosing a life that might not fit the box others reserve for women, Miriam traced the girl's small fingers with a thumb and told her plainly, "Love will ask you to be brave. Choose the life that asks the best of you, not the life others told you to accept because it is polite. If you can love fiercely and be loved fiercely in return, then courage and scandal are small prices for a wide life." The daughter listened with wide, steady eyes. Outside, the ranch hummed its constant hymn, horses pawing, wind through prairie grass, a baby's sleepy breath. The Hargrove children would someday tell their children about the preacher's daughter, who arrived in a wagon, about how she bent the rules and remade a home. They would speak of courage and of the ways love refused to be tidy. Miriam's life was not a tidy tale for salons back east to take apart with a fork, but it was full. It held worship and wood smoke, forgiveness and fervor, the ache of desire and the balm of companionship. She had married two tall men and had found a marriage to the land itself. She had learned that holiness could take many shapes. If you like this story, tell me where you're reading from and hit subscribe so I know to write more tales you want to read.